Good afternoon, class, and welcome to third lesson for our virtual learning experiences. I hope that you all are safe and well and that you all are completing your work, remaining scholars that we've been doing all year. I am extremely proud of those of you who have been participating and completing your assignments and still being dedicated to the work. It is not going unnoticed, and I greatly appreciate you all so much. And once again, I am so proud. Now, last week we did poetry. This week we're going to be focusing on narrative writing. Now, the lessons moving forward are going to be very, very, very important to you all because there will be an assignment towards the end of our writing lessons closing out the school year. So these are going to be very vital, very important to you. So if you are watching now, please pass this message along to someone in your class or someone in another 7th grade homeroom class. Make sure that they tune in to this lesson because this is the writing lesson 1, part A. This lesson and the next lessons are going to be very, very important for you all to tune in on. We haven't touched that much on writing this year. We have written 2 essays, but now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it, and this also is going to be a review. So like I said, please make sure that you let your friends know that Ms. Johnson has pulled out a lesson that is very important for you all to tune into, and I encourage you all to take notes. Again, remember, these YouTube videos are going to be up for the remainder of the school year for you all to always go back to. So do not fret and think that these lessons are going to disappear. They are not. I will keep them up because you all are going to need them moving forward. So let's jump into our narrative writing. So first off, what is narrative writing? We know that a narrative is something that tells a story. So now we're moving into what is narrative writing. So narrative writing tells a real or imaginary story. The author of a narrative uses dialogue, description, and other techniques to develop characters and events. The sequence of events, remember what we talked about in class, is the plot, focuses on a problem or situation and how the characters eventually solve them. So with narrative writing, with it telling a real or imaginary story, we have read stories in class with A Long Walk to Water, for instance, where we had our 2 characters, Naya and Salva. Now we know that Naya's story was made up. However, Salva's story was actually true. Naya's story would be an example of historical fiction. Now remember, fiction is anything that is not real. So when you hear fiction, think fake. If you have non-fiction, it's not fake. That means that is real. But with Naya's story, we can consider that historical fiction because although the story was made up, it took place in a real historical time. This took place during the post-Sudanese Civil War. So now we have an example of a narrative with Salva's story because his story told us about his journey to survival through the Second Sudanese Government War. And we have Naya's story as historical fiction as to what it might have been like to live during the post, which is after the Second Sudanese Civil Government War. So now those are stories that also use dialogue. We had a lot of dialogue, which is conversation between characters in the story. Salva had conversations with people along his journey, his family members, his uncles, also with the aid workers at the refugee camps. Then we have description. So a lot of description came from when Salva was describing how his feet felt when he was walking through those deserts with no shoes on, or how it felt through different times when he was without his family, his feelings. The author gave a lot of descriptive words to describe how he felt, what he went through, so that the reader could jump into the place of the main character. Then we have other techniques to develop the characters and events. So when we talk about those other techniques, that's when we start to dig deeper into the things that happened to Salva throughout the story. So the events that he went through that developed him into the character that he was at the end of the story. Certain events that happened that helped him develop into a person that he was at the end of the story. Think back to the pivotal moment in the story where we see Salva dealing with the death of his uncle. That changed who he was. The writer decided to put those different techniques in there to not only have us get a lens or get a look at what Salva was doing on the outside looking in, but we also got to jump into Salva's mind. We got his inner thoughts. We got dialogue between him and other characters, and we also got dialogue between him within himself, his inside thoughts. So the author decided to use those different types of techniques to help develop, to help grow the characters and the events. Now, when we talk about a problem or a solution, the problem in this case would be that Salva is fighting for his survival. He has nowhere to go. He's trying to get to a safer area. So his situation was that he was alone. He didn't have any family, and he wanted to get to a safer place and eventually get to America. Now, the story is going to tell us about how that happened. So that would be the problem, and how the character eventually solves them would be the steps that Salva took to get to the next step or get to the next location on his journey to survival. So with narrative writing, we have examples of different types of narrative writing. We've talked about folk tales. An example of a folk tale that we've used in class was The People Could Fly. Remember, a folk tale is a story that is passed through the oral tradition, which means from word of mouth, throughout generations. So this is a story that's passed down from time after time after time throughout generations. So if it starts with your grandparents, it'll be passed down to your parents and eventually passed down to you, and you in the future will pass it down to kids if you have them. Then we have myths. Of course, those are stories that are not necessarily true. Then we have plays. Now, plays are stories that are acted out on stage. They have a lot of dramatic effects. They'll have different settings. You'll see a lot of dialogue. Some of them may also include music. So you have plays that put on a performance on stage for an audience to look at. And of course, you have your poems. And then, like we talked about with our historical fiction and realistic fiction. Now, historical fiction is something that takes place. Remember, we said that takes place during actual time. Then we have your realistic, which is something that didn't happen, but it could happen. So an example of that would be someone creating a story about COVID-19, where they tell us a journey about a family who's, trying to get different resources. They're trying to make sure they have food, make sure their family is staying safe. It doesn't necessarily mean that that story is true. However, it is realistic, as in it could actually happen. Now, when we talk about narrative writing, this plot diagram should look very familiar to you because this was our narrative arc during the Module 3 Frederick Douglass portion. So you have your exposition, your rising action, climax, falling action, and your resolution. So let's start at the beginning. Your exposition is the beginning of the story where characters and settings are introduced. So this is the beginning of your paper. This will be considered your introduction, where you give us the very beginning of the stories. You tell us the characters and where they are. You give us a brief introduction to tell us what the story may be about. Then you move to your rising action, which would be your body paragraph, where the main character faces a series of conflicts. That means we have a problem here that the character is facing and how they're going about solving it. So that's where your story is going to build. It's going to build up to the most exciting part of the story, which is the climax. That is when we learn the outcome. Remember, the climax is going to be the most exciting part of your story. So for an example, when we talked about the narrative of the life with Frederick Douglass, think back to his fight with Covey. We finally see an African-American slave fighting back against a slave owner, a slave driver. This is the most exciting part of that excerpt, where we see at the beginning, remember Frederick Douglass, he kept to himself during his times where he could take a step away from the work that they were doing in the fields, and he decided to read. So at the very beginning, you get a glimpse at Frederick Douglass, and then we also get introduced to Covey, who we know is very brutal, very mean, and likes to break slaves. Now we have our rising action. Those were the parts of the story where it begins to build up to the climax. This is where the main character, which is Frederick Douglass, faces a series of conflicts. Now, Covey made it a mission to break Frederick Douglass because he saw that he was so different. So that part of the story is where we see that tension building up. we see that tension building up between Frederick Douglass and Covey, where Covey is pretty much picking on Frederick Douglass, singling him out, trying his hardest to break him. Once Frederick Douglass has had enough, then we get to our climax, which is the most exciting part of the story, which is the fight between Covey and Frederick Douglass. This is where we learn the outcome of their relationship, how they interact with each other moving forward. After that fight, Frederick Douglass won. Then we move to our falling action, where everything begins to settle. These are the events leading to the end of the story. So after that fight with Covey didn't speak of the fight. He didn't tell anyone about it. But yet, we move down to the resolution at the end of the story. Covey didn't bother Frederick Douglass anymore. He didn't speak about the fight anymore. And he respected him in a way that he didn't just take the abuse. He actually fought back. And of course, Covey was embarrassed to say that he was attacked by a slave and lost. So that's an example of your plot diagram. This is something that you can use when you're discussing your story, when you're planning your story. This is going to help you organize your thoughts. Remember, when you're narrative writing, you're telling a story. So this narrative arc, or this plot diagram, is where you're going to organize that so that you can go ahead and begin your writing. Now, when we talk about the action, when you're writing, you have to appeal to your readers, your audience's senses. So what do you see? How can you describe that in your paper, in your writing, to get the reader to get a visual? What do you taste? What adjectives, what figurative language can you insert in your paper to help your reader understand something that you're describing? Also, what do you hear? Describe sounds. Describe people's voices. Use descriptive language to give your readers an idea of what you experience. And also, what do you feel? Always express your emotions. Make it to where you're telling the story, but whoever is reading it could feel, hear, taste, and see exactly what you feel, hear, taste, and see. Now, also in your writing, you want to focus on your transitions. Remember, the first thing we talked about was your introduction. Things we've discussed in class. Remember, your introduction is your first chance to loop the reader in. So, hook, your attention grabber, draw your audience in. You can start off with a startling fact, or you can start off with a lot of commotion. Use automatopoeia. Say if you're telling a story about a thunderstorm, you might open up with boom. That's all I heard in the middle of a dark, stormy night when I was awakened by a thunderstorm outside of my window. You're making the reader ask questions. When you want to get your audience to hook in, when you want your attention grabber, you want them to start asking questions. Why did this happen? What's going to happen next? Well, who is this? Make them ask themselves questions and make them want to continue reading to get the answer to those questions. And also make sure you introduce your topic. Your introduction paragraph is going to tell the reader what your paper or your story is primarily going to be about. Give them an idea of what you're going to be talking about without explicitly saying it. What you do not want to do in your introduction paragraph is to say, my paper is going to be about blah, 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 or this story is about blah, blah, blah. Don't tell them. Don't announce it. Tell them. So don't make an announcement of what you're going to say. Just go ahead and say it. Then you have your body paragraphs. Remember to use your transition words. In conclusion, then, after. Those are considered transition words to help your paragraphs flow. Make your story flow from one paragraph to the next. That's going to make you write to where your paper's not so chunky and it's not all over the place, because you're keeping it organized by having one paragraph flow right to the next. Once you're done with your body paragraphs, then you have your conclusion. Remember, you're going to restate your topic, kind of close out your ideas. You don't have to literally restate what you talked about, but kind of do a recap of what happened. Close it out in a unique way. We're going to talk a lot more about these in more detail in our next lesson, but I want to brief over this with you all before we jump into our writing so that you remember what your introduction is, what a hook is, your body paragraphs, and also your conclusion. Now, before we close out, here's some tips for good writers. These are things that good writers do. The first and the most important thing, use a planner. Organize your thoughts. It helps you to keep your paper on one topic if you already have a blueprint of what you're going to talk about before you start writing it. So use a planner. Use a web, those diagrams that we've used in class before. What do you want to talk about? What story do you want to tell? Or if you have an essay prompt that you're writing to, help you organize your ideas. We're going to go to an essay prompt at the end of this lesson to give you an example. But always use a planner to organize your thoughts so that you know what you're going to be writing about instead of making it up as you go along and possibly getting off topic. Then we have your grammar check. In order to get the highest points on your essay, and this is also when you're taking 10 Ready or we're doing any district assessments, check for spelling and check for grammar. Also check for punctuation. Make sure that everything that you're putting into your paper is spelled correctly. You're using the correct punctuation marks, and also that your sentences make sense. You're not putting in incomplete sentences or you don't have any fragments. That's what helps you go back and reread. Rereading and revising. Proofread. Another thing that helps readers. Read your paper aloud. Once you appeal to your different senses when you're reading, proofreading your paper visually, you know what you wrote. Therefore, you're going to read it as such. However, if you read it aloud, you're going to hear if something doesn't make sense or you're going to catch it in a different way. So always, 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 before you submit any form of writing, always proofread. Read your paper aloud and then reread again. Those are things that we practice in class with rereading text to get a better understanding or to have things make sense. And read it aloud. That also helps, which is why I read aloud to you all instead of you reading. You just get a different type of comprehension when you're doing that. You understand things differently. You also hear things differently. So now let's take this to a writing prompt. This is an example. Now this assignment here is optional. This is going to be your practice before we jump into our assignments for next week. So the writing prompt. The prompt is something that you're going to be writing towards. It's prompting you to write. This is what you're going to be answering. So write a story about your favorite school memory. Who was there? Where was it? How did it happen? How does it end? Focus on one single event. So an example, if you played the violin in school, you would tell a story about playing violin in a concert. Or if you played on a soccer team, you could tell a story of your tryouts. Now, since we are out of school, this would be the perfect time for you all to reflect back to some of your favorite memories that you had while we were still in the building. So this is going to be your practice assignment. Write a story about your favorite school memory. In your paper, I want you to tell me who was there, where was it, how did it happen, and how does it end. You shall follow the narrative arc or the plot diagram. You can refer back to the other slide. So you're going to give me your exposition, your rising action, your climax, your falling action, and then also your conclusion, which is the ending. So when you're doing that, you should be able to answer those questions, the who, the where, and the how. So who was there? What was it and how did it happen? And also tell me how it ends. You're going to be telling me a story, remember, about your favorite school memory, whether it was this year, in 7th grade, 6th grade, 5th grade, it doesn't matter what grade you were in. Just tell me your favorite school memory and write about it. This is going to be your optional assignment to give you practice. Now, your assignments are on IXL for writing, and next week we're going to do part B of this lesson. This is just an overview. So if you need to refer back or if you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can comment below. You can send me an email. You can text me on Google Voice and Class Dojo. I have several platforms for you all to reach out to me with any questions that you may have. I look forward to you all and thank you for tuning in to this week's lesson. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.